Yeah, hello. So we are here to talk to you today about your book, Tricking Power into Performing Arts of Love, as well as your previous book, Disruptive Play. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks very much, Hilary. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure to have you. So you've been writing about the trickster. So what brought you to be interested in that archetype?
Yeah, I didn't come to the trickster archetype immediately. I was pretty young in the 1960s, but I was around and I was growing up then, and I was really fascinated by, just kind of the utopian visions of the time, that it was a time of great pain and suffering in terms of the war in Vietnam. But within that pain, there was also joyfulness and there was playfulness. And I was most attracted to that part of the anti-war movement that made fun of power, that mocked power, that, the event I love most talking about is how the Abbie Hoffman and a bunch of demonstrators levitated the Pentagon. Some say 30 feet off the ground, some say 300. Accurate records are difficult to find, but they, performed an exorcism, and so what resonated for me was not the trickster per se, but playfulness. And I thought, and so I became very enamored of this idea of grown-ups who have retained the ability to be playful as they were when children. And I was convinced that part of making the world a better place, which is kind of a mission statement so many people share now. So many people will talk about themselves, say, I'm just trying to make the world a better place. And for me, that meant a world where you don't have to outgrow playfulness. And I'm not talking about immaturity. I'm talking more in some ways in the Buddhist sense of childlikeness, not childishness. But I'm also talking about it being an action where you are playful. So I started investigating play, and I had this, it was kind of like a backburnered hobby because I had a career in education. But I kept reading and reading about play, and I wrote that first book, a first draft of that book, Disruptive Play. Well, as you might imagine, you can pick any topic and you can probably find an academic discipline that has an organization around it, and they have a journal and they have conferences. So sure enough, I discovered the Association for the Study of Play, and it's an organization of a lot of play scholars, but also a lot of people who do pre-K education, early childhood education, advocates for recess and so forth. So really good people doing really good studies and really good scholarship. And so I had this whole book written, and I went to the conference and I met someone there, and she was listening to me talk about the book, Disruptive Play, my first book. And she said, you really should read Lewis Hyde's book from the 1989-1990, Trickster Makes This World. And it's a wonderful book, so well done. And it had some real popularity there in the early 1990s. So I read that book and I went, oh my gosh, this is what I've been after all this time, yet I'd never put it in the sense of the trickster. So I had to go back and rewrite the entire book. So I went back and did it, and I'm glad I did, because there's a lot of mileage to be gained from it, given that archetypes are eternal. Since tricksters time travel, they're about the future as much as they're about the ancient past, and they're about the right now. So that's how I came to it, was through that pathway. Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely fantastic. And I like that you specify that it's more about the Buddhist sense of playfulness as opposed to just mere immaturity.
Right.
Because I think that's something that ends up getting lost a bit in some of the discussion.
Right.
And
of course, that's what the trickster is. And the other thought going through my mind was how I had not looked. I had neither rejected nor accepted. I just hadn't thought about looking at the world through a Jungian lens and seeing today's politics and today's society and culture as kind of this stew of various archetypes, where some get more dominant than others. And if I had to stand on one foot and tell you what was wrong with the world today, I would say that we have become infatuated with the warrior archetype, and that's a real problem, where we think all things can be solved by defeating our adversaries. And as well as I, you can't kill an archetype. They're all going to be around. It's a matter of proportion. So my crusade, if you will, is that the voice of the trickster get heard a little bit more. I don't want a world run by tricksters, but I want the trickster voice there.
One of the things that really resonated with me reading your book, and talking about the warrior versus the trickster archetypes, you mentioned the Marvel movies and how Loki is in a lot of ways a terrible trickster in those because of his search for power, which is something that's more the warrior archetype.
Right.
As opposed to the trickster who only achieves power through accident.
Right.
Doesn't hold on to it long.
Right. And I would encourage folks to get to my website. You just have to know how to spell my name. You spell Shepherd like the occupation. And Seagal, when in doubt, use an E, Siegel, shepherdseagal.com, because I write at length about Loki there. And I tip of the hat to Marvel for trying, but us Westerners, we love the good versus evil conflict, and tricksters are, to use a term, I love the term that Henry Louis Gates Jr. uses in The Signifying Monkey. They're not evil, but they're not good either. They're morally indeterminate, and the trickster tales are about characters who wander through the world morally indeterminate, meaning they just want to have fun, and they stumble and their tricks backfire as often as they work, but eventually they reach a point of moral discovery. And so the trickster can teach us about the birth of morality. And though I'm not fond of computer metaphors, it is kind of like rebooting your moral sensibilities to spend some time in the world of the trickster. So that's been something really influential to me, and also the fact that it gives you a refreshed look at morality that is not dependent on doctrine. So coming back to Marvel, so I just write about how it's just too tempting to have the good versus evil, and so they get some of it with Tom Hiddleston, wonderful actor, with their version of Loki, but tricksters don't amass armies. The power is what upsets them, and what they're more led to the mockery of power than the accumulation of power. And there's enough Marvel stuff where the Loki character is trying to assemble armies and wants world domination. They get other parts right, like how unreliable they are as allies and so forth. But when it comes to the accumulation of power, that's when it really goes astray. And so the thing I wrote recently was how the real trickster in the Marvel Cinematic Universe is Taika Waititi, and what he's done with the Thor franchise.
Oh gosh,
I'd encourage folks to look that one up.
Yeah, I just thought that was brilliant though, because I've seen so much discussion of that. So I was really happy to see that you addressed it within your book. You were talking about in your what you just said about the signifying monkey.
Right.
Could you explain a little bit about that to the listeners?
Sure. I mean, it's a monster of a book, and it's also a classic. When I say monster, it's dense, it's difficult, but it is. I think it's one of the books that really established Henry Louis Gates Jr. as one of the really a great thought leader and researcher and philosopher, and people know him now. And I love his cameo appearance in the Watchmen series, where he plays the U.S. Secretary of Treasury, and he's assigned with distributing reparations to people who've been wrong. But that's another story. But in The Signifying Monkey is really about how, first of all, let me say, every culture on the planet in their folklore traditions has, as far as we know, we've never found a culture that doesn't have a trickster god in there somewhere, a god or demigod. And the Yoruba one from West Africa is Eshu Elegba, who goes by a number of names: Papa Legba, Eshu Elugbara, Eshu Echu, many different spellings, many different names. It's all the same character, who's not necessarily an animal, is a humanoid actually, which is also unusual, but really complex. As far as, really kind of my favorite one to get into. And so the Signifying Monkey is kind of Eshu's sidekick, and also a trickster character in his own right. And Gates readily admits it's mysterious. We don't even really know how the Signifying Monkey showed up, but somehow in the Middle Passage, when so many enslaved Africans, made the Middle Passage to the New World, not just to the United States, but to South America, to the Caribbean, these folktales emerged. He specifically cites Cuba, and that the Signifying Monkey then swam the 90 miles from Cuba to Florida and also popped up in the folklore of the Delta regions in the southeastern United States. And all of a sudden there are these tales of the Signifying Monkey who is like a sidekick to Eshu. So that monkey does not, even though it's a jungle, portrayed as a jungle animal, is not part of West African folklore per se, but is inextricably connected to that folklore because of how he emerges in this country. And then it becomes this oral tradition I prefer the term Afro-Atlantic to Afro-American, because if I say Afro-Atlantic, I'm including Brazil, I'm including the Caribbean, as well as the southern United States. But the Signifying Monkey tale, it's just been told over and over and over again, and there's all these variations on it. I finally scored the CD that has Black folks from the South retelling the tale, where the monkey tricks the lion into fighting the elephant, because the elephant is the real king of the jungle. I'm not going to try to retell it now. I can't do it justice. But in my book, Tricking Power into Performing Acts of Love, I actually have 3 different versions of the Signifying Monkey tale in there. And it's a fun story. Another way for folks listening to the podcast to access it, Eddie Murphy made something of a movie about Dolomite that came out a couple of years ago called My Name is Dolomite. And if you look to the actual movie, Rudy Ray Moore is the inventor of the character Dolomite, and he stars in his own movie, and it's one of the very first blaxploitation films. As you recall, the New York Times called it the Citizen Kane of Kung Fu pimp movies. And it's really great. And it's accessible. It's for sale. It's made something of a comeback, probably thanks to Eddie Murphy's work. And if you get a hold of the original film Dolomite, there's just this tremendous scene where Dolomite reopens. He gets out of prison and he reopens a nightclub that had been closed down. And he goes into the nightclub and he just gets on stage and he tells the Signifying Monkey tale. And it's as good as any version of that tale that you'll read. And it's a lot of fun because you can watch it in an early 70s movie.
Yeah, it's brilliant, the retellings within your book too. But to actually hear it, recorded and spoken, it gets so much better. Yeah.
The CD, if folks are interested, is called, I think it's called Get Your Ass in the Water and Swim Like Me. And he's got 3 or 4 different versions of the Signifying Monkey tale, and he has other African-American folk tales that who knows how far back their origins go. A lot of it was lost in because of the way the tribes were broken up when enslaved Americans were brought over. They consciously broke up tribes, and so a lot was lost. But the miracle is what survived.
Yeah, and what survived is absolutely brilliant.
Mm-hmm. I agree. It's a good picture of the tricks of who the trickster is.
Yeah, and you went through within your book talking about the various traditions that survived and how Muhammad Ali was an excellent example, of that sort of trickster spirit existing within a person.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought him up, because it was going through my mind, and the name is escaping me right now. But he had a sidekick. He had this sidekick who I swear to God personified Bundini, I think was his name, and he was kind of like the signifying monkey. And I mean nothing racist in that when I say that appellation, because I say it with honor and respect. I listen. I'd be one myself if I could, and it's that same thing where Ali himself is Eshu, is a personification of the trickster god, who makes this pilgrimage back to Africa, and he's as popular in Africa as the Beatles are in the United States. They and there was the rumble in the jungle, where they had that. And the other thing I want to say about Ali is first of all, I was absolutely transfixed by Ken Burns' 4-episode documentary on Muhammad Ali, and it was absolutely brilliant. And when Ken Burns takes on a subject that's in recent enough memory that there's a lot of live footage, it's just fantastic to have all that and the way that they choose to make their story. And the thing I say about Ali is that, like many, virtually all successful athletes, the warrior force is strong with them. With some professional athletes, they also have heroic qualities, so the hero is strong with them, but it's very rare. I don't know if I can name a sports celebrity like Muhammad Ali with whom the trickster force was also very strong. And Burns touches on it, doesn't quite get it. And just so you know, I don't love everything. Michael Mann, where Will Smith played Ali in the Hollywood movie, absolutely misses the point and portrays Muhammad Ali as a perpetually angry person. And I couldn't imagine somebody getting it more wrong. And Ken Burns sets the record straight in a way. There was a lot of joyfulness and playfulness. I talk about how scatology is part of the trickster personality. And when Muhammad Ali was known as Cassius Clay, his nickname was Gaseous Cassius. And so it's the markings of the trickster, that show up with him over and over again.
Yeah, and I was actually reading recently about the history of rap music and how Muhammad Ali and his, quick-witted quips and the way that he would, playfully jab at his opponents. That sort of use of language was instrumental in the start of rap music.
Sure.
Which was also something that I just hadn't really known before.
Oh, rap in particular, right.
Yeah, it was just really interesting. You have a little section in your book that's just a bunch of his quotes that I was enjoying so much I had to read them out loud,
Yeah, they do read well.
Yeah, they read brilliantly. You were talking about the making of the trickster within your book, and how seldom it is that we see feminine tricksters, or we see trickster taking female form occasionally, with drag, with that sort of transformation, but to have the feminine themselves be a trickster is a more unusual thing.
Yeah, and so the book, besides a fun little thing on time travel and a couple chapters on slapstick, the book has 2 beating hearts. And one of them explores this very thing of Afro-Atlantic culture and of Eshu. But the other beating heart of the book is the idea of the female trickster, which is very hard to get a hold of, and there's a few reasons for this. One is that most of the world has been patriarchal for so long that the men get all the good parts, so to speak, and so the folk tales tend to feature male, and even though tricksters ultimately, there's a really neat African scholar who makes the claim correctly, I believe, that tricksters really have no gender. Mm-hmm. They're and isn't it ironic that they're the oldest stories known to humanity, and that the oldest character known to humanity is a gender fluid character. However, I think in a great deal because of the patriarchy, they're initially presented as male. But whether you're talking about Wakchunkaga of the Winnebago tribe, who changes sex whenever, or Bugs Bunny, who cross dresses, or even is it Loki himself, who
Loki gets impregnated as a mare
because he needs a horse. He needs a horse, and he becomes pregnant with Sleipnir. Right. It happens in all of them. But they're often initially presented as male, and the trickster tales have an affinity to the stereotype of the playboy. It is not the same thing as the playboy, but because they don't tend to raise families, but they're highly sexual creatures, you're going to see a lot of the male sexuality, but you don't see the child rearing, which is also part of the reason you don't see the female tricksters, because the child rearing got, the women have had to do more of it historically. So that's part of the problem. The other part is that, a lot of our knowledge about tricksters comes through anthropology. And it wasn't, I think, until like the late 1930s that there was even such a thing as a female anthropologist. So the anthropologists would go out to these indigenous cultures and visit them and take their notes and do their studies, perhaps with very good intentions, but either the men were in charge of the storytelling, or the male anthropologists were more interested in hearing from the men, or, and I think this is important, that even if they wanted to talk to the women in these cultures, they may not, since they couldn't talk woman to woman, since there were no female anthropologists, it might have been harder to establish the trust where the women might have shared their tales. And then the final reason why it was a challenge I took up with relish. I really enjoyed the challenge, but it was not easy to dig stuff up. And the other difficulty with drawing a picture, if you will, of the female trickster is that the stories that we do have, the characters frequently are sketchy. You learn a couple things about them, but you don't learn enough about them to really be able to more conclusively say, oh, and she is a great example of the trickster. So when I discovered a book by a woman named Marilyn Jurek called Scheherazad's Sisters, it was an entire book about female tricksters. And it's she who, in that book, that educated me really about these difficulties. But through that, and of course, Scheherazade herself, I don't write about Scheherazade, but she's a really pretty good example of how, with 1001 Arabian Nights managed to stay alive, basically through trickery. But also the pirate princess of, and the story occurs in a few different cultures, but the one that I used was the pirate princess of Yemen, was a more drawn out profile. And of course, this leads to the entire chapter I devoted to Yoko Ono, who I believe is a wonderful modern exemplar of a trickster character. But even Yoko, it can be difficult because there was so much bustle around her fame and her marriage to John Lennon and their relationship, which actually, as you will read in the book, that the marriage and the union and their attempts to have an egalitarian relationship between her and John actually gives birth to a more modern edition of the trickster, where you can be a loner, because tricksters are loners, but you can also be in a loving union with another person that's fully respectful. And they reached a point of union where they were very comfortable speaking for each other, for example. So that was a challenge that I just, because one of the most exciting things about research is to find out you're wrong about something, and to go, oh, okay, it's not, there's more than this male lens on the trickster, and then start digging around and coming up with something better. Because if we come back, Hilary, to the main purpose, making the world a better place, we have no chance of making the world a better place until there's the full participation of women, and that also means that our folklore itself, you don't have to rewrite it, but you have to rejigger your perspectives on it if we're going to come. And if you believe that the archetypes in their essence are transcendent figures, are semi-divine, well, you can't be semi-divine and sexist at the same time. So we have to re-explore this folklore and find, separate. Let's use the patriarchy. There's other difficulties in the world, but separate what part of this folktale and this mythology is the patriarchy speaking, and what part of it is a more transcendent and eternal archetype with a more what's the word I'm looking for? A more evolved message to share.
Yeah, do you think that there's going to be more talk and more consideration of the female trickster moving forward? Because I think that your book did an excellent job of highlighting that figure, people who could exemplify those characteristics throughout history.
Yeah.
And with more women in comedy now, do you think that there might be more of a discussion of it in the future?
I do. I mean, yeah, I hope so, because it's the perfect candidate. Because if an oversimplification of the trickster is, the guy in the bleachers who says, the emperor has no clothes. In fact, it was used as a headline to describe our former president just the other day, and I went, yep. And so I do think that what better place for that conversation to happen? Because my point being, if you have the in film and comedy in particular, where it's been male dominated, and the trickster's compulsion is to mock power and to speak truth to power, I think it's inevitable. And people are talking more and more about comedy these days, and writing about comedy and what is comedy and how does it work and what works and what's more upsetting to people and so forth. Yeah, I think that's inevitable.
Yeah, I thought that the recent animated show that Lisa Hannawalt was doing, Tuca and Birdie, did a really good job of kind of sending up people in positions of authority, whether having the landlord that took over the main character's building be literally just moss, taking over everything, growing over everything.
Please say the name of it as a series on TV.
Tuca and Birdie. It was really interesting because in the animated form, like using that media, you can really have very fluid characters. You can have them transform. You can have a lot of scatological humor.
Okay, all right.
And just see what it does. But being helmed by a woman, a lot of the topics that were discussed were different to what I'm used to seeing in animation.
Okay.
Because it was more of a focus on interpersonal relationships, like sexism in the workplace, etc. but it struck me as just I think that would be an interesting, avenue to look at in terms of how the female trickster might differ from the male trickster.
Right, right. Yeah. And in fact, there's a section in the book that says, well, how are female tricksters, that we discover them, how are they similar to everything we've said so far? And then how are they different? And that difference hopefully doesn't mean that you have two categories, but it means that we've expanded the concept. And that's what was so exciting to me. And as far as relevance for today, I just want to say that I realize that people who are coming out in different ways, whether it's because they're gay or because they're trans or whatever their variation on sexuality is, that makes them a minority and perhaps has caused them pain and has caused them some suffering, and it's a very serious for them, especially if they've been harassed or their mental health has been affected. I don't diminish any of the seriousness of that, but I also feel that I want to see us get to a place where this gender diversity is celebrated, and for the trickster, I think it's gender's a plaything.
Yeah.
They play tricks with it. And I mean, Bugs Bunny, in so many of his cartoons, he cross dresses and he kisses Elmer Fudd, and seduces Elmer Fudd, and it's always funny. And I just think that the world has to include both. And I think part of my inspiration, once again, when I was growing up, not only in that era of the 60s and the 70s, but it was in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was exposed to the I'll call it the gay revolution that was in the Castro district of San Francisco, where there were parades all the time and drag was really celebrated, and it was a party, and we all know what AIDS did to that party, but let's not forget the party. And the attraction to having fun.
There was an old what's his name? Just left me in a second. Popeye. It was an old Popeye comic strip.
Oh.
Where he first gets Sweet Pea, and he dresses up in a dress and a bonnet, holding Sweet Pea and feeding Sweet Pea, and describes himself as having to be both mudder and fodder to Sweet Pea. And one of the characters is like, well, how can you be a mudder to Sweet Pea? He says, well, I'm amphibious.
Amphibious.
Just that kind of fluidity was absolutely hilarious to me. Like it's really, really funny, but it also is a really progressive way of looking at things, which is kind of that trickster line.
Don't you think some of the most radical cultural thinkers back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s and onward even were the cartoonists, the people doing the
definitely.
cartoons? Yeah,
definitely. You talk about Bugs Bunny a fair bit in both of your books.
Mm-hmm.
I think that you talk about his history first in Disruptive Play,
right,
and how it was a whole group of people who first came up with the character.
And this is what got me locked into a Jungian perspective. So first of all, I do think Bugs Bunny is the great American trickster. And I will, my only disclaimer before I delve into this is that Bugs Bunny is portrayed by the late 70s on. I think maybe they lost their grip on the trickster archetype that informs Bugs Bunny. But let me share the more interesting story of how I came to it. So I already told you about how I met this person at the conference, and she turned me on to the Lewis Hyde book. And through the Lewis Hyde book, Trickster Makes This World, it led me in my research to this other spectacular book that came out about 1955, 56 by an anthropologist. Oh my God, his name just escaped me. Paul Radin. His name is Paul Radin, and it's called The Trickster. And I'm reading it, and the large portion of the book retells the tales of Wakjunkaga. And Wakjunkaga is the oldest story known to humanity, and is a trickster story, and Huachincaga is of the Winnebago tribe. And so I'm reading these episodes, these trickster tales, and you get the gender shifting, and you get the scatology, and you get the tricks that backfire. You know, this is a very fully fleshed out portrait of the trickster. But as I'm reading these stories, I'm going, wow, most of these little episodes could be told in about 7, 8, 9 minutes. And like by the time I've read the 20th, 30th one of these tales, I'm going, oh my God, it's Bugs Bunny. The connection is incredible. And so that book came out in the mid-50s. Now, Bugs Bunny cartoon started out in 1938 or 39. His first Academy Award nomination came in 1940. I think it was A Wild Hare. And so I'm thinking to myself, okay, somehow this, as you said, Hilary, you know, it was a collective effort, not just Mel Blanc on voice and Carl Stalling writing these amazing music, but the writers. And then there was like 3 or 4 different directors: Tex Avery, a guy named Clampett, Max Fleischer, I think, you know, about who were the directors. But there was a writers group and a writers room, like for any comedy series. And they had this strong sense, even if they couldn't express it, that they knew what worked with what was Bugs-y-ish and what wasn't. And so I became convinced that they were really channeling this archetype because, and I don't want to presume, but I don't think these cartoon story writers were reading anthropological studies. Paul Radin's did not even come out for another 15 years. But here they are channeling this character that in many ways is identical to the trickster god, the trickster demigod, if you will, of the Winnebago tribe, Huachincaga. And that was the epiphany that really became the guiding light for everything that I wrote from that point forward.
I think that it's that universal, archetype that is part of the longevity of, Bugs Bunny and like Coyote and Roadrunner too.
Right.
Because it's funny, it's funny and it resonates.
Right. And of course, let's just look at one of the, when I really hope folks will pick up my book, and in an early chapter in Tricking Power, talks about the 10 attributes of the trickster, and to talk about one of them is the tricksters. Nobody likes being humiliated. I'm not saying they like it, but the trickster is willing to take the risk that the trick will backfire, or that he or she will suffer some form of humiliation at some point. And the beauty of the Bugs Bunny cartoons is that every now and then his tricks backfire, and he has to suffer that humiliation, and it becomes part of the humor. And so when people ask me, for example, if, is Donald Trump a trickster? Is the force strong with him? And I say, he's the person who's very averse. He does not willing to accept any risk of humiliation. And a true trickster, for the sake of the party, for the sake of having fun, for the sake of playing a trick that might backfire, they're willing to accept that risk. Now, but it's not every time. Sometimes the tricks work, sometimes they don't. And so I do like the Coyote and Roadrunner one. And Coyote, of course, historically is a trickster figure, and I believe throughout North America. It's not just one tribe, it's in many tribes. I know you've spent a lot of time with Coyote. And but in the cartoons, he always loses. None of his tricks ever work.
There was actually a list of 9 rules that guided. Did you see the list of 9 rules that guide every one of the Coyote and Roadrunner cartoons?
Oh no, I've never seen that.
I want to say it was Tex Avery, but it was one of the people involved had a list of rules, and they were kind of playing in my head while I was reading your books, because there are rules such as the Roadrunner cannot harm the Coyote except by going beep beep. No outside force can harm the coyote, only his own ineptitude or the failure of the Acme products. The coyote could stop anytime if he were not a fanatic.
Oh, I love this. This
Yeah,
is
so it goes on, and it's like the coyote is always more humiliated than harmed by his failures.
right.
Yeah, so
Right.
there's that gentleness, to it, where
Mhm.
if the injuries were permanent, if we focused on it too much, it would be tragedy. But because he's just more humiliated than anything else, it's fine,
Right.
and he continues
Right.
on.
And then it goes on. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I thought that was just a really interesting bit, because it's also the thing, if he catches the roadrunner, what happens? It's not about the what happens when he catches it. Like, I think he catches it in one of the cartoons and just holds up the sign that says, "Well, what now?"
But now
know?
I love it. Yeah, you can just see these writers having fun. But listening to you talk about this, I'm thinking to myself, well, the coyote in those cartoons is in and of himself not the trickster, but if you combine the coyote and the roadrunner, you get a trickster consciousness that they each play their role as each one of them is a different part of a person's emotional, spiritual, archetypal personality profile. And to me, that's an epiphany, because the point I really want to make to your listeners is that, I talk about characters, some fictional, some non-fictional, whether it's Yoko Ono or Muhammad Ali or Bugs Bunny, or the signifying monkey or Eshu in the book, because that's how we communicate these days as we tell stories. But it's not like I want my readers to recognize it when we see people or fictional characters who personify trickster. But what I'm really after is trickster consciousness, that it's a part of everybody, and the force is stronger with some than others. But that in to come back to an earlier point, that when we are looking at the public commons, you have to have the warrior. The warrior comes in really handy. I just want the warrior to sit down and shut up for a while and let the mother speak and let the hero speak and let the trickster speak, and it doesn't have to be embodied in a particular person, but it has to be part of all of us, because Americans, we know the warrior. We know the warrior. We watch it on TV every Sunday during the football season. We love and respect our veterans, and I do too. And we have the most powerful military in the history of the world, and the Pentagon is, in fact, the center of warriorness. Okay, I get it, but let's make room for more in our public dialogue.
One of the things I thought was really interesting, because although the trickster is not seeking a position of power,
Right.
you made a great point in your book. You're talking about how the trickster, spirit, that consciousness,
Yeah.
can still achieve a great level of not exactly success, but it is success. It is aptitude, mastery, through the force of Sun Ra,
Oh,
who
right.
had, with his orchestra, one of the best bands in the world.
Right.
So, just because a person's a trickster doesn't mean that they can't, accomplish some pretty great things.
Well, that's wonderful that you brought Sun Ra up, because I don't see Sun Ra himself as whoever thought we would be connecting Sun Ra to the Roadrunner and the Coyote, but in and of himself, he's not a trickster, but he created a space where trickster consciousness could exist in really an ineffable form. It wasn't necessarily in a particular musician, but more in the space that he created, and and he's just one of the jazz greats. And another more recent example that I write about is Michaela Coel in I May Destroy You, the HBO series.
Mm-hmm.
Her character is not a trickster, but she wrote that whole thing. She directed it, she starred in it, and she creates a world in that limited HBO series that I believe is a real clue, and it's dangerous. It's got a little bit of chaos. Trickster is all about, a little bit of chaos. And it's a chaotic world that TV series describes, and where anything can happen. But the thing I want to make sure your listeners hear, is that this is kind of an essential step towards making the world a better place, towards a very high moral good. But you cannot get to a better world with a strict moral doctrine.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have some psychic freedom. You have to let the trickster speak. The beauty of the trickster is that, as I said earlier, they go through eventually they come to an episode of moral discovery. And we as a human race have to reach that moment of moral discovery. We can't win it in a war. You can't enforce it through a religious or a political doctrine. It has to be a shared discovery. And once again, so I'm not talking about trickster heroes. I'm talking about a consciousness where we stumble into moral discovery collectively.
How might you suggest the listeners tap more into that trickster consciousness within themselves?
Ah, boy. Well, get my books and read them. And I hope they'll have an effect, have that effect that people will start to recognize it more. That when people are discussing things, and look, I'm as guilty of it as anyone, there's a part of me that's very sure about what I think is right and what I think is wrong, what I think is good, what I think is evil, but that when that they might engage in conversations, especially with our divisions, our political divisions in the country right now, that in their conversations, they might be willing to relinquish just for a moment. You can have it back. You can have your moral doctrine back whenever you want it, but let go of it for a little while and see where the conversation leads. And I just, for the folks who were on my mailing list, I just today put something out about utopia, that I think that Trickster lifts the veil and allows us to start talking about what a more perfect world would look like. And it's I don't know if we have time today, but what you'll see, especially in the Tricking Power book, is the connections between the trickster and the not necessarily a fleshed out concept of a utopia, because that could fall into doctrine very easily, but more to opening the door to a free-ranging conversation about what a more perfect world would look like. And the thing that I sent out by email today was, I talked about folks who are not tricksters at all, but they're very serious heroes, whether it was Bill McKibben and his work on the environment, or Greta Thunberg and her work on the environment, and philosophers like Cornel West, and political leaders like Stacey Abrams, that they have a long-term vision. There's this new guy on the scene, William McCaskill from Scotland. But then there are trickster types like the Yes Men, and Banksy and so forth, whom I write about, and I think they open the door and they clear the threshold so that these other folks who have the substantial ideas of what we can do to make a more peaceful world, a happier world, a world that solves some of our problems. Since the tricksters just want to have fun, they know that they'll never really have full-bodied fun until sexism and racism and all the other isms of hate are that we've gotten past them, until we've stopped the planet from burning up, and we've stopped killing each other. They know that, and they encourage us to look beyond, because what happens when you do solve those problems? What kind of world are you creating? Everybody's well fed, and we're not diseased, and we're living healthy lives, and we're loving each other, and we're not sectarian in any ways. Oh, we're going to have fun. Wait, and before we close, I want you and I in unison to say, because you knew the exact words, and I think I've got it, but we have our spiritual leaders, not just Bill, but Bill and Ted.
Yes.
And what they say is, be excellent to each other.
And party on.
Party on. So we should say that in unison before we sign off today.
But first I want to ask, are you working on anything new?
Well, yes and no. I never intended to even write a second book. So what happened is I was touring behind Disruptive Play, and I got really good feedback from the audience. Where are the women?
Mm-hmm.
Where are the people of color? And I don't apologize for the fact that, once again, in the era where I grew up and the things I was exposed to growing up in the 60s and 70s, it was white males I was exposed to. Wonderful white males: Marcel Duchamp, Alfred Jarry, Abby Hoffman, Andy Kaufman.
The Marx Brothers.
And then the Marx Brothers. Thank you. Yeah, we didn't even get to talk about them, and so the books are real good companions to each other. And I went, because after touring and getting this feedback from my audiences, I went, I really do. I need to flesh this out. I need to address it. I need to write about the feminine. It turned into an amazing research challenge. And then I got into the signifying monkey and the Afro-Atlantic and and of course slapstick and Bill and Ted. And so I think there's a third one out there waiting, but I just kind of want to party on.
That's perfectly fine, because you do have a wonderful website,
Thank you.
which again, people can find at shepherdseagal.com.
Right.
With a newsletter, with a blog. You can get the books there, and I read both of the books. I think they're absolutely wonderful, and I think that everybody should read them.
Well,
but I will definitely be watching and waiting to see whether or not a third book comes.
Yeah, me too. So shall we say it together?
Yeah, we have to. Be excellent
to each other.
And party on, dudes. Thank you so much.
Thank you also.